All right, let's dive deep into some religious beliefs. We've got this fascinating collection of excerpts today from a text called Expose the Myths of Religious Hypocrisy, Be Informed, Know the Truth.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it's really something. This source, it really dives headfirst into debunking common religious myths.
I see.
And it uses verses from a bunch of different scriptures, like to back up its claims.
Okay.
So we're going to explore some of these myths. We'll look at the scriptural evidence and just see what we can learn.
Sounds good. One thing that jumps out at me right away is the way this source uses the term religious hypocrisy.
Yeah.
It suggests that there's like a disconnect between common practices and what the scriptures actually teach. Like it's calling us to go back to the source, and question what we've been taught.
Makes you think, doesn't it? So the first myth they tackle is this idea of God being formless.
Right. They use verses from all sorts of texts, like the Rig Veda, the Yajur Veda, the Quran, the Bible, even the Guru Granth Sahib, to argue that God actually has a form.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, for instance, they cite a verse from the Rig Veda, Mandala 9, Sukta 82, where God is described as seen like a king.
Interesting, because the idea of a formless God is so prevalent in so many different traditions.
You're right. It is. And this is where I think understanding the historical context is crucial.
Yeah.
You see, the concept of formlessness, it's been interpreted in many different ways throughout history.
I can see that.
Some people see it as, representing a divine essence, something that's beyond human comprehension, while others believe it emphasizes God's omnipresence.
Right.
But this source seems to be challenging those interpretations by highlighting verses that point toward a more defined image of God.
So they're not saying that formlessness is wrong, but maybe just incomplete or misinterpreted.
Precisely. They're encouraging us to look at the scriptures with fresh eyes and consider alternative interpretations.
Okay, I like that. So they also bring in the Yajur Veda, chapter 5, verse 1, which states that God has a form and maintains everything.
Right.
And then there's the Quran, Surah al-Furqan, which talks about God establishing himself on a throne.
Exactly. And those are just a couple examples. The source, it goes on to cite the Bible too, Genesis 1.26-27, where God creates mankind in his own image and likeness.
Right, right.
And they even quote the Guru Granth Sahib, page 1257, which says God has a body and is alike to everyone.
It's fascinating how they're pulling from, all these different texts to challenge this idea that many consider fundamental to their faith.
It really is. It definitely pushes us to examine our own assumptions about God and to dig deeper into the scriptures we hold sacred.
Okay. Now, the second myth they go after is this idea of there being many gods, and this one really seems to tie into their whole critique of religious hypocrisy.
Absolutely. They argue that the concept of multiple deities, it kind of contradicts this idea of one supreme God.
Right.
Which is a concept that shows up across different religions.
Yeah, that's true.
So they're suggesting that focusing on the differences between religions might actually be a form of hypocrisy, because this core principle of a singular divine power, it's often shared.
Okay, and they even mention a specific name, Kabir, as this supreme creator.
Yes.
So what can you tell us about this figure?
Kabir. Well, he was a fascinating figure.
Yeah.
He's revered in both Hinduism and Sikhism.
Interesting.
He was a 15th century mystic poet. And he preached this message of unity and devotion to a single God. He challenged the rigid social and religious norms of his time, emphasizing the importance of inner experience over outward rituals.
So he is a bit of a rebel in the spiritual world.
You could say that, yeah. His teachings, they transcended religious boundaries and focused on the universal essence of spirituality.
Okay, so the source uses his teachings to support their claim of one supreme God.
Precisely. They cite verses from various scriptures to back up this idea.
Like?
Well, for instance, they quote the Rig Veda, Mandala 9, Sukta 96, which says God has only one form. And then they jump to the Quran, Ayah 25.52 and 25.59, which states there is only one supreme being, the creator of the universe.
And they also quote the Bible, Job 36.5, which says, God is mighty but despises no one.
Yes.
And the Guru Granth Sahib, page 24, simply states the supreme being is one.
Exactly. They're highlighting the common thread that runs through these diverse religious texts. It all points toward a singular source of divine power.
Right.
It's a powerful argument against polytheism, and it really reinforces their stance against religious hypocrisy.
Okay, so they've got God having a form and only one supreme God. What other commonly held beliefs do they challenge?
Well, they debunk a whole bunch of myths related to specific religious practices,
Oh, that's good.
and they don't hold back.
All right, hit me with them.
First up, they tackle the belief that bathing in the Ganges brings salvation.
Ooh, that's a big one, especially in Hinduism.
Absolutely. The Ganges is considered sacred in Hinduism, and many believe that bathing in its waters can, wash away sins and lead to liberation.
Right.
But this source challenges that notion head on.
Huh. So kind of going along with that idea of rituals, the source also challenges this belief that pilgrimages offer spiritual benefits. They even have a, well, rather pointed quote about it.
Oh yeah, they say, there are many creatures like turtles and fish in pilgrimage waters, but they do not attain liberation. Instead, they suffer.
Wow.
Yeah, and they also point out that pilgrimages, fasting, and ancestor worship are all considered useless practices.
Okay, that's a pretty provocative statement. So are they saying that all rituals are meaningless?
I don't think so, no. I think their point is that the outward act alone isn't enough.
Okay.
True spiritual growth requires inner transformation and a genuine understanding of the scriptures.
So it's not about blindly following traditions, but about understanding the meaning behind them.
Exactly. They seem to be emphasizing the importance of intention and genuine devotion over empty rituals.
Okay, that makes sense. What's next on their list?
Next, they address the practice of fasting, which is something that's, well, it's common in many religions.
Yeah, I've always thought of it as a way to discipline the body and the mind, like a kind of spiritual purification.
It certainly can be, but this source argues that fasting doesn't inherently lead to liberation, and it often leads to idol worship, which they say is forbidden.
Their quote for this one is pretty blunt. If fasting could bring salvation, then why do so many die from finger?
It's a stark reminder that physical deprivation alone doesn't guarantee spiritual enlightenment.
Yeah.
And speaking of idol worship, that's the next myth they debunk.
Which is kind of fitting since they just brought it up.
Right, they argue that true worship can't be achieved through idol worship,
Huh.
and that God can only be attained through scriptural worship.
Okay.
They have this very concrete example to illustrate their point.
What is it?
They say, if God could be attained by worshiping stones, I would worship mountains.
Interesting how they use these very relatable examples to challenge these beliefs.
It is, isn't it?
What stands out to you from that?
Well, it makes me think about the purpose of idols in religious practices.
Uh-huh.
If they're not meant to be worshipped directly, then what role do they play?
Yeah, good question.
Right? It's a question that's been debated for centuries.
Yeah, I bet.
Some believe that idols serve as, well, as symbolic representations of the divine,
Okay.
helping to focus our attention and devotion.
Makes sense.
Others see them as tools for connecting with specific deities or energies.
Right.
But this source, they seem to reject any form of idol worship,
Huh.
emphasizing the importance of direct communion with God through scriptural study.
Okay, so no holy water dips, no shortcuts through fasting, and no idol worship. What's next?
Well, then they address the practice of worshiping ancestors,
Okay.
something that's common in many cultures.
Yeah.
But the source says this doesn't bring salvation
Yeah.
and is actually forbidden in many religious texts.
And they have another pointed quote for this one, too. People mistreat their living parents, yet carry their dead ancestors to the Ganges in vain.
It's a powerful statement.
It is. It's what they're saying. Focus on the present, on your actions now, rather than clinging to rituals for the past.
Right. It's about prioritizing our actions and our relationships in the here and now,
Yeah.
rather than relying on rituals that might be disconnected from our lived experiences.
Okay. What about this idea of achieving salvation through severe austerities?
That's another myth they tackle.
Mm-hmm.
The source acknowledges that. Austerities might grant certain powers,
Okay.
but they don't actually lead to liberation. They
Interesting.
even suggest that they could result in lower births in the next life.
Wild.
Yeah.
They even say, through severe penance, one may achieve wealth, but in the next life, they may be born as pigs or dogs.
Right, it's like a warning against pursuing power through self-inflicted suffering,
Uh-huh.
suggesting that true spiritual growth comes from inner purification rather than outward displays of piety.
Okay, so we've covered bathing rituals, fasting, idol worship, ancestor worship, pilgrimages, and even extreme austerities. What else is on their list?
Well, they also challenge this idea that charity is always beneficial.
Okay.
Their argument is that charity without the guidance of a true guru
Uh-huh.
or without a pure heart is essentially meaningless.
And they say, without the guidance of a true guru, even reciting prayers or giving charity is futile.
Exactly.
It's like a very specific caveat.
Yeah.
It suggests that intention and proper spiritual guidance are crucial.
Yeah.
This brings up another interesting point. Their emphasis on this true guru, it seems to be a recurring theme.
You're absolutely right. And this is where things start to shift a bit.
Really?
Yeah, the source starts to focus on a specific path to achieving true spiritual knowledge.
Okay, this is getting intriguing.
Yes.
Tell me more.
Yeah, it's like they're building this case against blind faith and tradition and urging us to seek out, genuine spiritual guidance.
I like that. Don't just go through the motions, right? Understand the why behind the what.
Exactly.
What's the next myth they tackle?
Okay, so they then challenge this belief that bad deed can't be erased. They say that with the power of God and the guidance of a true saint, bad deeds, they can be erased and life can even be extended.
Wow. That's a pretty hopeful message, considering how strong as they've critiqued, some other practices. It seems a little contradictory, though, doesn't it?
How so?
Well, they've spent all this time debunking myths, emphasizing the importance of scriptural knowledge, and now they're introducing this idea of a saint who can erase bad deeds.
It does seem like a shift in focus, yeah.
Right, like they're presenting a specific path to salvation now, rather than just critiquing existing beliefs.
You could see it that way, yes.
And this path seems to hinge on finding this true guru or true saint. I even have a quote that emphasizes this.
Oh, which one is that?
They say, "When the holy name is held in the heart, all sins are destroyed."
Interesting.
Yeah, it suggests that just having faith in this true saint can lead to redemption.
Okay.
It's a pretty bold claim. What else do they say about this path?
Well, this is where they introduce the concept of satlok, which they describe as the eternal abode, the true destination for the soul.
Okay.
And they contrast this with heaven, suggesting that heaven is just a temporary realm.
So they're not just reinterpreting existing beliefs. They're introducing a whole new concept of the afterlife.
Precisely.
Wow.
And they attribute this knowledge to a specific individual, Saint Rampalji Maharaj.
Ah, so this is where that figure comes into play.
Yes.
Okay.
The source seems to position him as the provider of this true knowledge, the guide to reaching satlok. They even have a quote that seems to describe this realm.
What does it say?
Countless waves of mercy arise, but in satlok there is no pain.
That sounds incredibly peaceful, but it also raises a lot of questions, like who is this Saint Rampalji Maharaj, and why should we trust him as the sole source of this knowledge?
Good questions, and unfortunately, the source doesn't really provide much context or background information.
Really?
No, it's almost as if they assume that the reader already knows who this figure is and just accepts his teachings as truth.
That's interesting because on the one hand, they've encouraged critical thinking, questioning traditional beliefs, and now they're presenting this figure and his teachings as seemingly unquestionable.
It is a point of tension within the source material.
Yeah.
It seems like they're advocating for a very specific path to salvation, one that revolves around this particular saint.
Okay. And this path seems to differ quite significantly from the teachings of more established religions. They even address this directly when they talk about the belief that there's no rebirth.
Right. This is where they specifically mention that this is a common belief among Muslims, but they argue that rebirth does happen, citing evidence from the Quran and other texts.
They even have a quote, "Not a single grain decreases or increases without the will of God, as written in destiny."
Right.
It's almost like they're trying to find common ground with a belief they disagree with.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
They seem to be saying that the Quran, like other scriptures, actually supports the concept of rebirth, even if it's not explicitly stated or commonly understood.
Exactly. They're essentially reinterpreting these texts through the lens of their own belief system.
Right.
One that centers on the teachings of Saint Rampalji Maharaj and the attainment of satlok.
And that brings us to their final myth, the belief that changing gurus is a sin.
Right. They argue that changing gurus isn't a sin until you find a true saint. They use a really relatable analogy for this.
Oh, what is it?
They say, when one doctor cannot cure the illness, we seek another doctor.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's a practical way of framing the search for spiritual guidance.
Right.
But it also seems like a clever way to justify their focus on Saint Rampalji Maharaj.
How so?
Well, they're essentially saying, keep searching until you find him.
That's a good point. Yeah, it seems like their ultimate goal is to lead people toward this specific path to salvation, even if it means challenging long-held beliefs and reinterpreting established religious texts.
So they're not just debunking myths, they're building a case for their own belief system.
Precisely.
And this is where things get really interesting, because they end the source with a warning about false gurus.
Oh, wait.
This is where things get a little tricky, don't they?
Yeah, they claim that false gurus mislead people for personal gain,
Okay.
spreading false beliefs, and arbitrary practices,
Hmm.
and they explicitly state that. Saint Rampalji Maharaj is the only one who provides scriptural-based worship and true spiritual knowledge.
So they're making a pretty bold claim there, singling out this one individual as the source of truth.
They are.
It's a real contrast to their earlier emphasis on questioning traditional authorities and seeking knowledge for oneself.
It is a bit contradictory, yeah.
It raises a lot of questions about spiritual authority, and how we determine who to trust on our spiritual journeys. So
Absolutely.
it seems like this source offers a compelling critique of religious hypocrisy, but then it presents its own set of beliefs as the only valid path.
It's definitely a complex message.
It is, and it's potentially controversial.
Yeah, it challenges us to think critically about the sources of information we trust, even when those sources claim to be based on sacred texts.
Right, blind faith, even in a charismatic leader, or seemingly profound teachings, it can be dangerous.
It can.
We always need to engage our critical thinking skills and evaluate information carefully.
I agree.
So how do we navigate this tension, then, between seeking guidance and remaining discerning?
Well, I think it starts with recognizing that no single source has all the answers. We need to be open to different perspectives, but also willing to question and challenge what we're told.
It's about finding a balance between openness and skepticism.
Right.
We should be open to learning from others, but also willing to think for ourselves.
Exactly. And I think this source, despite its strong claims and potentially controversial viewpoints, can actually be a valuable tool for sparking that kind of critical reflection.
How so?
Well, it forces us to confront our assumptions, to examine our own beliefs, and to consider alternative perspectives.
Like a catalyst for deeper exploration.
Exactly. It's not about blindly accepting or rejecting everything we're told,
Uh-huh.
but about actively engaging with the material
Hmm.
and forming our own informed opinions.
Okay. It's fascinating how this source, I don't know, it kind of walks this line between encouraging critical thinking and then presenting its own very specific path to salvation.
You're right. And some might even say it's rigid.
Yeah, exactly. It's like they're saying, think for yourself, but think exactly like us. It makes me wonder about spiritual authority, Like if we're supposed to question everything, how do we ultimately decide who to trust, who to follow?
That is a profound question. And I don't think there's a simple answer. It's a journey, a process of exploration and discernment.
Right.
We can learn from teachers, from texts, from traditions. But ultimately, we need to find what resonates with our own hearts and minds.
That makes sense. This source seems to suggest that Saint Rampalji Maharaj is like the ultimate authority, the one with the true knowledge.
Right.
But even if we accept that premise, what about the millions of people who lived before this saint? What about those who have never even heard of him? Are they all doomed?
That's a question the source doesn't really address.
Yeah.
And it kind of highlights the limitations of any belief system that claims to have a monopoly on truth. The beauty of spirituality is that it's vast and multifaceted, like a landscape with many paths leading to the summit.
I like that.
What works for one person may not work for another, and that's okay.
So this source gives us some valuable insights, right,
Yeah.
into the potential pitfalls of blind faith and the importance of questioning tradition.
For sure.
But it also presents a very specific path that may not resonate with everyone.
Exactly. It's crucial to remember that. This is just one perspective, one interpretation among many.
Right.
We need to approach it with a critical eye, taking what resonates with us and leaving the rest behind.
That's a great takeaway for our listener. This source is a powerful tool
It is.
for reflection and exploration. But it's not a blueprint for everyone's spiritual journey.
Absolutely not.
Well, this has been a really thought-provoking deep dive.
It has.
We've debunked myths, explored the nature of spiritual authority, and even caught a glimpse of a different perspective on the afterlife.
We have. We've been challenged to question our assumptions, to examine the scriptures with fresh eyes, and to consider alternative interpretations.
Yeah, and most importantly, we've been reminded that the journey of spiritual exploration, it's ongoing, a process of continuous learning and growth.
It is.
So to our listener out there, as you continue on your own path, remember to stay curious, keep questioning, and always seek what resonates with your own heart and soul.
Well said.
Thanks for diving deep with us. Until next time, keep exploring.